I'm here with Dr. Jason at Robinet Physical Therapy, and we are going to show you a number of stretches that are going to be very valuable for us to integrate in our warm-up.
For the trunk rotational crossover stretch, the player will begin laying on his back. He'll lift one leg up into the air until some tension is felt, and then he'll drop the leg over to the opposite side. The goal is not necessarily to have the player with his leg all the way over, but only to feel a stretch in the hip area. Variations on the stretch can include having the leg straight or the knee bent, whatever is more comfortable for the player. The spinal twist stretch is performed in a sitting position on the ground. The player will start by crossing one leg over the other, placing the foot down onto the ground. Then they're going to rotate their body towards the leg that they have crossed. The arm can come across the thigh, applying a little bit of pressure for an increased stretch. That stretch can either be felt into the lower back or in the hip of the leg that is crossed. For our next stretch, we're doing the knee to opposite shoulder stretch. This can be done with the player laying back on the ground, bringing the knee up towards the opposite side shoulder using the hands to create some pressure. The hands can be positioned on top of the knee or underneath the thigh. That is a variation that won't make a difference. It should be whatever feels comfortable to the player. Another variation of this can be in a sitting position on the ground, pulling the knee up towards the chest. On days where the ground is not suitable to be laying on the ground, the player can also perform this in a standing position, which adds a balance component to it, which takes away from the stretch, but is a much better option than laying on a ground that's not appropriate. The IT band stretch with lumbar flexion is performed in a standing position. The player will take one leg and cross it behind the other leg, then leaning away, trying to point the hip out to the side. This creates a stretch down the side of the hip or up into the hip. The kneeling hip flexor stretch will be done in a kneeling position. From here, the player is going to work on tilting their hips, rotating upward towards them to create the stretch on the inside of the thigh. Visually, it's very difficult to see any motion there. But if the player reports they're feeling a stretch through here or down the thigh, then they're doing it correctly. If they have not rotated their hips up, they will not feel that. If they have rotated their hips up and they're still not feeling it, they can then give a slight lean forward, but that should not be emphasized over the tilting of the hips. Our next stretch is the high lunge, very similar to kneeling on the ground for a lunge position to get a stretch into the inside of the hip. The player will separate his feet to a comfortable position. From there, they're going to tilt the hips up towards them to feel the stretch on the inside of the top of the thigh. If that stretch is not felt, they can adjust the position of their knees to increase that and give a slight lean forward if needed. The dynamic hamstring stretch is performed with the player laying on the ground, sitting up. From this position, their legs are ideally straight. However, if a player complains of tightness with their legs straight, it's okay to have a slight bend in your knees. From here, they're going to start to lean forward just from the waist, not reaching with their hands, until they feel that tension begin to increase. From that position, they will flex their head down, forward into the increased tension, and back up in a slow, controlled motion. The goal is not for them to go as far as they can, just till they feel the tension increase, and then bring right back up out of that. The next variation on this can be done by bringing the head forward into the tension, and then leaning forward from just the waist, forward and backwards. Again, into a comfortable pull, and then back out of the pull. Lastly, we can come forward with the head down and the trunk into the tension, and then move the ankles up and down. This creates a hamstring stretch as well as a neurological stretch. Our next dynamic hamstring stretch is done in what we're calling a frog sitting position. The player will draw one leg up, bringing the foot towards the leg, relaxing the outer knee outside. From this position, they will begin to lean forward from the waist until tension is felt. That tension can be in the leg or in the back, wherever they feel that. From here, they're going to bring the head down, increase tension, and back out of that. Again, keeping it a comfortable pull as they do that, slow and controlled. Variations can include bringing the head down and then bending from the waist to create the increase in pull, slowly up and down, or bringing the head down and the trunk into a comfortable pull and moving only from the ankle up and down. The next dynamic hamstring stretch is a standing clock stretch. The player will start with their feet apart. We're going to go towards the 3 o'clock clock position, which will be towards the right foot. But instead of holding the stretch, the player will do a bounce for their dynamic, keeping the bounce comfortable. From the 3 o'clock, they'll progress into 2 o'clock, working their way around the clock, always making sure that the bounce they feel is a comfortable pull. The goal is never to go as far as you can with a dynamic stretch, because you can overstretch that muscle. The bounce has to be controlled. The player will work their way around over to the 9 o'clock position. Once they reach the 9 o'clock position, they can repeat the clock back over to the 3 o'clock.
So we're going to show the dynamic hamstring with arm swings, and Dr. Jason is going to move his arms high up first above his head, then he starts dropping down, bending at the core, and there's our hamstring stretch coming up. So a little bounce, going back, the legs can be completely straight or have a slight bend in the knees.
In the core facilitation section, we have ball stomach press outs. The player will lay on their back, knees bent. It will require a prop, although it's not necessary. As the players get better with it, they can do this just with their hands, but using the ball gives a good feedback for the player. With their hands on top of the ball, the player will gently press the ball down into their stomach, the soft part of their stomach. From there, they're going to tighten their stomach muscles to push the ball back up. And if they're doing it correctly, you should see movement as they tighten their stomach muscles. At the top, once they've tightened, they're going to hold that for about 3 seconds to get that brain to muscle connection going and facilitate the core. The only other thing to watch out for is the player should not be holding their breath while they're keeping that stomach muscle tight. For core facilitation as a warm-up, I also recommend doing planks. Plank can be done on the elbows. The player will bring him or herself up off his or her knees, trying to achieve a straight line position between the shoulders, the hips, down to the legs. If the player is unable to hold this position, then they can come onto their knees to facilitate the core. The goal is not to strengthen the core, so this does not need to be held for a very long period of time while the player holds an abnormal position. It would be much better that the player be on their knees if they're not able to hold that straight line. For core facilitation as a warm-up, we're also going to be doing side planks. Side planks will be done on the elbow with the player in a straight line position. Once they begin to raise themselves up, it is important that the shoulder, the hips, and the legs stay in line. It'll be very common that the shoulder rotates forward and the player may need to be cued to keep that back. If they're unable to maintain that position easily, they can come down onto their knees rather than stacking the legs or separate the feet to give them a wider base of support.
So now we're going to show the hip openers inside to outside shuffle. So again, it will incorporate some of the hip flexibility with some small movement and being on the bounce. So Jason, if you lift up your leg and then spread it out. Yep, quick little bounce, come back the other way, find some rhythm, and keep pushing that knee up and around. So now we show the hip openers outside to inside, or close the gate as we call it as well. So Jason is going to lift up his right knee, make it come across to his left, make a little hop, slightly go backwards. So as you see, the angles are changing all the time. Make a little bit of a hop in there. There you go, rotation of the hip. So leg swings straight, kind of replicates our shooting motion. And what we'll see is that we start swinging the leg. And first is your plant foot stationary. And we're just kind of relaxing in our shot here, Dr. J. We just kind of keep moving and keep hitting, keep kicking it out all the time without a stoppage. We're going to keep swinging. Now we're going to increase our swing, which kicks our leg up. There you go. Keep going at that. If you keep your left arm, doctor, just kind of let it go. Yes, let it go. So next in line is the diagonal or across the body leg swing. Again, hits the inside and outside hip flexors as well. So coach is going to show the leg is going to travel across your body. Yep, keep going at it, left to right. You increase it if you can, so get some rhythm if you can do that. From there then, we're going to increase the power basically, and you start hopping on the other leg. So can we get into a hop? Balance, coordination, flexibility. Next in line is the Sideway lunge with pulse. So here we start standing on one leg, and then we're stepping out to the side, go deep in there with the bounce, and push back off and see if we can regain our balance. So this is about balance, coordination, and ultimately stretching the inside of your thigh. Next up as a dynamic stretch is the forward lunge with pulse. So here we have the player starting again with the leg up on one leg on the knee, stepping forwards, going down and stepping back, holding again the balanced position if they can. It's not about trying to actually make big, large steps. It's more about making sure that we have the balance coordination and we have the bounce happening. We'll show you now the walking forward lunge with a twist, a rotation twist from a trunk. So Dr. J is going to make a step forwards. He's going to start rotating his trunk. We do it 2 times left to right, then he moves forwards again, and this becomes now a little bit more in relationship to what we're doing on the soccer field as well. It's forward motion. Again, trunk, rotation. We'll see we're working on balance. We're working on flexibility. So now is the walking flamingo stretch for the quadriceps. So we're starting with grabbing the ankle and putting it to our buttocks. Stretch it out with a little bit of a short bounce, leaning forwards. Then we let go and make a big step forwards with the knee in an elevated position. And we'll continue to repeat this with the other leg.
Our next dynamic warm-up will be skipping with arms moving forwards and backwards in rotations. Erwin will demonstrate the player begins by skipping, bringing the arms in a forward direction, and then returning with the arms in a backwards direction, reversing. Our next dynamic warm-up skip will be the high jump skip. The player begins by driving the knee up in the air while moving the opposite arm up in the air with it. Emphasis on bringing the knee up and driving the arms for height. Our next dynamic skipping involves more functionality for headers. The player will begin with the same high skip, but at the top of the jump will simulate a header to the right and to the left. On the way back, you can return with a double-footed jump versus the power skip with the high skip. Off 2 feet, header.